basically what we said, there are three parts to nature capital. The first part is just basic value of raw material. Therefore, suppose we have a forest and we have bamboo there. If you cut the bamboo and you sell it, there's a value to that.
Yeah,
Secondly, there's a value addition to that. So the value addition to that is you take bamboo and you make it into clothing or furniture, etc. So that's the
yeah,
second piece. And the third piece is what nature capital everybody is talking about is the ecosystem services, which is
yeah.
obviously more heavy and more complicated. The combination of these three is actually called nature asset management. And last year, I did mention to you what we've been trying to push the government, saying that if you have 1,000 square hectares of forest, why don't we value it the way we would value any kind of building? And if you really value that, your value in Arunachal is greater than the value of Maharashtra and its industry. So we are moving in that direction of valuing it just on basic value. We're not even talking about value addition, which is the second level, let alone talk of the third level, which we believe is the ecosystem services and more relevant and necessary piece. So in that, because you've been our inspiration, I just thought it's important that you just throw some light on nature capital, how far is it going, natural asset valuation, etc., etc. So over to you.
Great pleasure to be part of the ninth Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum. Ranjit, thank you for inviting me again. I've been involved with great pleasure in a number of these very important events in the past. I want to strike a rather optimistic tone. I hope not falsely optimistic, but there have been, in this last year or two, some really positive developments in the way in which natural capital, the economics of nature, and the role of nature in economics and social development have been real progress in how people understand these issues. Thank you, Ranjit, for allowing me to be again part of the Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum, and with the title this time, Ecology is Economy. That title, Ecology is Economy, I think has become more deeply understood in the last year or two. So I will therefore strike a slightly, I hope not excessively, a slightly optimistic note, in the sense that I think the case that you have all been making in the Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum for so long has really started to gain traction. Let me illustrate that. I think when people talk about the economics of growth, or the new economics of growth now, they normally talk about four sorts of capital: physical capital and human capital, of course, but now routinely natural capital is included in that story. And indeed, social capital is often added as well for good reason. So that, I think, is an approach to understanding growth and development which is gaining traction. The understanding of what the value of natural capital means, again with your leadership, I think is deeply. Clearly, the natural capital produced by forests and other natural resources, the usufruct, if you want to use old language, is directly useful. I mean, cutting bamboo, cutting wood in a sustainable way. That is a real product. That's forest services in that case. And of course, people work on, there's secondly value added to the usufruct. You work on the timber or make something from the bamboo. But also, and thirdly, and I think extremely importantly, there's the value of the services that nature produces. And there has actually, for a while now, as you all will know, been an intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And that is crudely called the IPBES. And this year, for the first time, in June, there was a joint meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which has been there since '88, and the IPBES. So that's an illustration that those scientists working on climate and those scientists working on biodiversity and ecosystem services are getting together. We've also had in this year quite a close understanding of the interrelationship between COP26 in Glasgow, where I was for a couple of weeks earlier this month in November 2021, where natural capital was prominent, I think really for the first time to this degree in a conference on climate change, COP26. But of course, we've also got COP15 on biodiversity coming up in Kunming next spring. So you've got the juxtaposition of the IPCC and IPBES in terms of their joint meeting, and you've got these two COPs, COP15 on biodiversity, COP26 on climate, coming within the space of a few months. I have been very much involved with the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate, and they have recently got together, and they had in November, just a couple of weeks ago, a natural capital accounting workshop. That's Ministers of Finance organising a natural capital accounting workshop under the rubric of the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action. So those are just three examples of the way in which the discourse and analysis and perspective that you've been pioneering for so long is now becoming embedded in finance ministries and in economics. We all know the power of finance ministers and finance ministries. I've worked in a finance ministry, I've been chief economist of the World Bank. That's where the power lies, and that's where the resources are allocated. But I think as a result, in large measure, of the efforts of you and your colleagues involved in similar activities around the world, these ideas are now getting to where they need to be. I mean, too late, of course, but better late than never. There is now a task force on nature-based financial disclosure, which is in parallel to the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. The TCFD is now well established, and financial firms have to disclose the climate risk they run. They're now starting to, with the TNFD, to follow the same course. There is a burgeoning voluntary carbon markets story arising from the fact that so many private sector firms have committed to net zero, and they're looking to buy offsets in the voluntary carbon markets. Some of us, I'm a bit involved in the beginnings of how to regulate and set rules for that. In that story, many of us, including myself, are arguing very strongly that you're not just buying an offset, you are actually buying something associated with development. So the quality of that offset is not simply the carbon side of the story, the negative carbon, it is also your contribution to development and biodiversity. So I think in the ways I've tried to describe, in very real parts of international discourse around finance, that you are starting to see those arguments which you've embraced and developed and articulated for so long are getting somewhere. So I think you should, pride is a sin, but I think you should feel some satisfaction in the advances that you've made. Now, in this story, of course, the Eastern Himalayas is absolutely center stage. Center stage in the richness of its resources, center stage in, of course, its influence on so many hundreds of millions, indeed billions of people around that region. So important, of course, in terms of its place in the whole world ecosystem. But I think one more reason is very important, and that's the political story of countries which might have difficulties on some dimensions of interaction, finding common ground around biodiversity and climate and the integration of biodiversity and climate into the whole story of development. And that's one good thing I think we saw in Glasgow, COP26, is the way in which countries were coming together around this issue. United States and China got together in a way that they haven't succeeded in finding before in terms of friendly relationships around climate. I believe they will around biodiversity as well. Prime Minister Modi gave a very important speech in the first week of the Glasgow COP26, where he explicitly linked the whole story of climate, which of course was the primary subject, to the nature part of the story. And that speech was very well received. Indeed, I think a landmark speech in COP26 and actually the history of India's economic development. So that is a slightly optimistic story. It's a story that really celebrates some movement in a good direction, which you have been very much part of, and indeed in the vanguard. That doesn't mean that victory is in sight, but it does mean that traction where it's needed is starting to occur. And I think you should draw considerable satisfaction from that. So I wish you the very best of luck with the 9th Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum, and enjoy. And I know you're going to contribute as you always have done.
No, thank you, Nick, for that very inspirational direction and confirmation that nature capital is meaning on the agenda. Just 2 points I wanted to make. Our eastern Himalayas, we've now got Nepal, we've got Bhutan, we've got Bangladesh, and we've got all the eastern states. So that makes it an even more powerful sort of recognition. And next year, we're hoping to, in December, have the Eastern Himalayan Naturenomic Forum live, hopefully without COVID, in Dhaka. So you more than welcome. We will invite you as one of the keynotes and help us to organize it so that we get the best in the world to help Bangladesh actually sort of get out of the challenge that they are in, which is really caused by the world and caused by ourselves all together, from the Himalayas, the glacial melt, the water, the floods, sea level rising. There's nothing which Bangladesh is not being affected by negatively. So I just think that focus on Bangladesh will be focusing on world issues also.
I think the having of the 10th Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum in Dhaka in Bangladesh would be a very big event, and I'm sure that the world will listen still more as it started to listen already.
Yeah. See you in Kunming, because that's an important landmark. Evaluation of biodiversity and valuation, which Kumar, your colleague, Das Gupta has done. Fantastic work on that too.
I'll do my best to be there. And Partha and I had a public discussion together at Glasgow to demonstrate that we shared, as it were, the same objectives and recognize the interweaving of climate and biodiversity.
Completely, completely. And that's really what we are. Just to let you know, finally, that the Balipara Foundation is very proud to announce that we are actually on the journey of planting biodiversity assets, which people normally call as trees, but the way it's in forests, of over 100 million in the next 3 years. And we've got the community. It is totally owned by the community, driven by the community. It's totally about social, it's totally about healthcare, it's totally about education and livelihood. So, that's really our model now, much to what you actually pushed us to do 10, 15 years ago. I think it seems to be all fructifying now. So thank you for that.
Oh, that's absolutely tremendous. And congratulations on the work you're all doing. And I'm sure you'll have a tremendous forum.
Thanks, Nick.